Updated one cells in Greek life. L10R, greetings, my dear night owls, late night thinkers, and those who have stumbled upon this quiet corner of the digital world in search of something a little more substantial than the usual chatter. I hope you'll forgive me for assuming that you, too, are sitting comfortably, perhaps in a dimly lit room, maybe with a glass of wine or some other civilized beverage at your elbow, or even just curled up on the couch with a notebook, ready to jot down insights that would make a philosopher blush. If you'd like, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight. It's always rather charming to imagine the global tapestry of listeners gathered around this little story. And while we're on the topic of small favors, if you enjoy these meandering explorations into history, do consider hitting that like button or subscribing. It's the kind of support that doesn't shout, but lingers in the background, warm and unobtrusive, like a well-aged wine. No pressure, of course. I'm quite happy to keep sharing my ramblings whether you're part of this community or not. Now, let's dim the lights a little further, shall we? The topic at hand is one that dances delicately between the poles of culture and cruelty, refinement and ribaldry. Did ancient Greek banquet guests secretly judge each other's taste? It's a question that might seem like it belongs to some high society gossip column of the past, but in reality, it cuts much deeper than that. It's about power, performance, and the quiet, often brutal social hierarchies that lurked beneath the polished surface of Athenian symposia. So, if you'll indulge me, let's pour ourselves a metaphorical cup of Kylix and settle in. The ancient Greeks, particularly our friends from classical Athens, had a complicated relationship with taste, both literal and figurative. They prided themselves on their sophistication, their love of wine, poetry, music, and the finer things, but beneath that veneer of cultural superiority lay a society that was, at its core, deeply competitive. The symposium wasn't just a place to drink and chat. It was a stage where men, because, let's be clear, these banquets were almost exclusively for men, played out their social roles with the intensity of actors in a tragedy. And like any good drama, there were audiences, stars, and critics in the wings, ready to whisper judgments that would sting more than a drop of unwatered wine down the wrong throat. To understand this, we have to step into the world of the asterisk symposium asterisk, which wasn't quite the cozy gathering it sometimes romanticized as. Imagine a room filled with wealthy Athenian men, senators, poets, philosophers, though Socrates, bless his troublesome soul, was more likely to be the odd one out than the center of attention, and perhaps a few young boys serving as wine pourers or entertainers. The atmosphere would have been thick with incense, the air heavy with the scent of myrrh and olive oil, while slaves bustled about refilling cups and warming up more wine in bronze cauldrons. But the real action wasn't happening on the floor. It was happening in the eyes, the raised eyebrows, the knowing smirks that passed between guests. The symposium had rules, of course, at least officially. The host set the tone, often reciting verses or performing music to set the mood. Guests would recline on couches arranged around a central table, drinking from shared cups, the asterisk kylix, in a kind of communal ritual that was both bonding and, let's admit it, an opportunity for one-upmanship. The wine itself was a status symbol. The best came from Lesbos or Chios, aged to perfection, while the cheaper stuff was watered down by slaves who knew exactly how much to dilute based on the guest's reputation. Too little water, and you risked getting a guest drunk too quickly, embarrassing him in front of others. Too much, and he'd notice, and that would be an insult in itself. But here's where things get interesting. While the official role of the symposium was one of camaraderie, education, and intellectual exchange, at least according to the philosophers, the unofficial role was far less wholesome. The Greeks were masters of asterisk komos asterisk, a word that means both revel and banquet, but also carries with it the sense of controlled chaos, the playful yet dangerous edge of a gathering where inhibitions could slip just enough for true colors to show. and what came out was often not so flattering. Consider the role of the asterisk symposiarch, the man chosen to lead the symposium, usually by lot, but in practice it was often someone who had earned the position through charm or wealth. His job wasn't just to keep the wine flowing. He also oversaw the drinking rituals, ensuring that no one got too rowdy, unless they wanted to, which was part of the game. But the real power lay in the unspoken rules. How you drank, what you said, even how you held your cup could be judged. A guest who drank too quickly was seen as vulgar. One who lingered over his wine was suspected of being a drunkard or worse, a coward. The ideal guest was the one who could hold his liquor just enough to appear sophisticated, but not so much that he lost control. Though, let's be honest, some of these men were far more interested in losing control than maintaining it. And then there were the asterisk comestai, the revelers who would sometimes break into song or dance, often accompanied by a flute player or a young boy singing. These moments were supposed to be playful, even artistic, but they could also turn ugly fast. A guest who stumbled over his words, who couldn't keep up with a drinking game, or worse, who got asterisk too asterisk drunk and started singing bawdy songs or making lewd remarks. He became fair game for mockery. The Greeks loved their irony, sarcasm asterisk, which comes from the Greek word sarkastai asterisk, meaning to tear flesh, and they had no qualms about using it to strip someone of dignity in front of peers. But the real judgment wasn't just in the drunken outbursts or the misplaced compliments. It was in the asterisk silences. A guest who didn't participate in the conversation, who didn't engage with the poetry or music being shared, or even worse, who didn't drink enough to prove his worth. He was judged for his restraint, for his lack of enthusiasm, for not playing the game correctly. The symposium wasn't just about taste in wine. It was about taste in asterisk, everything asterisk. A guest who couldn't appreciate a good song, a witty remark, or a well-turned verse was seen as lacking refinement, as being beneath the company he kept. And here, where we get to the heart of the matter. Was this judgment secret? Probably not entirely. The Greeks were masters of subtle communication, and much of the social dynamics at a symposium played out in glances, nods, and the careful calibration of tone. A guest might overhear a remark that was clearly aimed at him, but phrased as if it were directed at someone else. A classic example of what we'd call passive-aggressive today, though they didn't have a word for it then, or if they did, it's lost to history. But the judgment wasn't just in the words. It was in the asterisk omissions asterisk. A guest who was ignored in conversation, whose jokes fell flat, or whose presence seemed to dim the brilliance of others. He'd leave the symposium with a reputation tarnished, not necessarily because anyone said so outright, but because everyone knew. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Greek symposia, the role of asterisk erotic tension. Young boys, asterisk eromna asterisk, were often present at these gatherings, serving wine or playing music. They weren't just there for practical reasons. They were part of the performance, a living embodiment of beauty that guests could admire and, if they dared, pursue. But even here, judgment played a role. A guest who showed too much interest in a boy was seen as vulgar. One who showed too little was considered cold or unmanly. The ideal balance was delicate, and stepping over the line, whether by being asterisk too asterisk aggressive or asterisk too asterisk restrained, could lead to ridicule. Of course, not all symposia were this cutthroat. There were moments of genuine camaraderie, of deep conversation, as Socrates might have hoped for, and even of true artistic appreciation. But those moments were the exceptions, not the rule. The symposium was, at its core, a space where men could perform their masculinity, their wealth, and their cultural sophistication, all while being judged by their peers in ways that were both overt and covert. And this is where the historical evidence gets really interesting. We have descriptions from writers like Plato and Xenophon who paint a somewhat idealized version of the symposium, emphasizing the intellectual and philosophical aspects. But we also have more candid accounts from comedic playwrights like Aristophanes, who had no qualms about exposing the uglier side of these gatherings. In his play, The Knight's Asterisk, for example, he marks the flattery that went on at symposia, where guests would lavish praise on each other in the hopes of currying favor or securing a political advantage. It's a far cry from the refined image the philosophers wanted to project. Then there are the visual arts. Vase paintings from the time often depict symposia scenes, but what do they really show? The images are frozen moments, guests reclining, cups in hand, sometimes with young boys or flute players. But what's missing is the asterisk tension, the unspoken judgments, the way a glance could make someone squirm. Art doesn't capture the silence, the knowing smirks, the way a guest might hold his breath as he waits for others to react to his latest wit. And let's not forget the role of asterisk drinking games. One popular game involved passing a cup around while guests recited verses or made remarks. If someone refused to drink or stumbled over their words, they'd have to take a sip, and the more wine they consumed, the more vulnerable they became. It's easy to imagine how this could spiral into something less about skill and more about who could endure the most humiliation without cracking. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from the asterisk symposium itself as a concept. The word asterisk symposium means drinking together, but it also implies fellowship, harmony, words that belie the reality of what was often a deeply hierarchical space. The Greeks prided themselves on their democracy, at least in Athens, but even in a democratic society, wealth and status mattered. A guest's ability to hold his own at a symposium wasn't just about personal charm. It was about proving he belonged among the elite, that he could match wit for wit, refinement for refinement. And here's where we have to ask, was this judgment fair? Of course not. Judgment in any society is rarely fair, especially when it comes to performance, whether it's at a banquet or on a stage. But the Greeks weren't naive about it. They knew that social spaces were battlegrounds, and they played the game with a wink and a nudge, knowing full well that the rules were fluid, arbitrary, even cruel. But they also understood that the game was part of what made life interesting, that the risk of humiliation was the price you paid for the chance to shine. So, did ancient Greek banquet guests secretly judge each other's taste? Oh, absolutely. Not asterisk secretly in the sense of whispering behind hands, but subtly asterisk, with 1,000 small gestures and glances that added up to something far more damning than any outright insult. It was a judgment that could make or break reputations, that could determine who got invited back to future gatherings and who was left on the outside looking in. And it wasn't just about wine, it was about everything. How you spoke, how you drank, even how you held yourself. But let's not romanticize this too much. The Greeks weren't villains. They were humans, flawed and brilliant, capable of both profound thought and petty cruelty. They knew the cost of their games, but they played them anyway because, as Plato once wrote, though perhaps with a hint of irony, wine gives, in the first place, courage to those who have it not, and in the second place, speech to those who can speak. And if that speech sometimes cut like a knife, well, so be it. It was part of the fun. Now, as we bring this little exploration to a close, let's return to where we began, curled up in the quiet of night, perhaps with a glass of something civilized in hand. I like to think that if the guests at an ancient Greek symposium could see us now, reclining, metaphorically, on our couches, sipping our drinks and discussing taste, not just of wine, but of culture, of judgment, of human nature, they'd be amused. They'd recognize the performative aspects of our own social gatherings, the way we still play games of status and refinement, even if they've taken new forms. But perhaps there's a lesson here for us, too. The Greeks didn't pretend that their symposia were pure or unblemished by judgment. They knew it was part of what made them human. And so, as we reflect on our own social spaces, whether they're dinner parties, work meetings, or online forums, we might do well to remember that judgment isn't something to be feared. but something to be acknowledged, perhaps even embraced with a hint of irony and self-awareness. So, my dear companions in this late-night reverie, I'll leave you with the same invitation I extended at the start. Dim your lights, if they aren't already, take a moment to breathe, and consider where you are in the world tonight. Are you listening from Athens, perhaps, or from some other corner of the globe? And as for me, I'll be here in this quiet